stand up straight. Don't bend your back.
What happened? Did you
Oh,
in
this?
front of something? Yeah. The wife finally said enough already.
You should have said it when Victor was here. No, I fell in the basement of the National Academy of Medicine.
Oh my
I
God.
just
Okay.
went flying.
Great.
You've been over there.
I have.
And did
Yeah.
you ever drive into their?
Yeah, I have.
So I drove in there and I was looking for the visitor elevator because they wouldn't let me in the staff elevators. And I was late for my meeting. I was rushing. I was looking up, never saw the speed bump. And I just hit it and went.
Gravity won.
Up, and I had my hands full, so I had no way of braking. And I would have gotten a Colles
This just happened
fracture.
to my brother on the weekend. The exact same thing. He was holding something.
Yeah.
He couldn't put his hands out in front
Yeah.
of him.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good to see you here.
Welcome to this session, which is focused on how global health fits within U.S. foreign policy and U.S. global security calculations. We have currently with us, we have three of our speakers. I'll introduce them momentarily. There's a fourth on the way. I'm Steve Morrison. I'm Senior Vice President here in Washington at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. We have a large global health policy center program there that I direct, and we wanted here to take advantage of the CUGH gathering to try and bring in a number of people, a select number of folks who've served in different positions within government under different circumstances politically in terms of both Republican and Democratic administrations, informative moments where their impacts and what they were observing was dramatic and powerful and fast-moving. The premise here behind this is that, in fact, global health is becoming a bigger part of U.S. foreign policy and security calculations. That's what's motivated us. I think we'll hear in the stories that are told by our speakers, I think we'll hear illustrations of the way in which this phenomenon was driven forward. Obviously, some of it stemmed from the very dramatic expansion of commitments and programmatic aspirations and goals over the last 15 years. Simply moving from $1 billion per year to over $10 billion per year in your global health programs, and moving towards having a third of your foreign assistance commitments in those signatures itself means that it's going to change your bilateral relationships. Hi, Bob. They'll have long-term and very heavy implications. In that period, of course, there emerged this entire rationale that this was part of a smart power diplomacy, and that began to beg questions of what does that mean. All of these big initiatives like PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, the launch of the Global Fund, involved conspicuous presidential leadership, and that by itself creates expectations of very high-level oversight and management. They were dependent upon close management of relations with Congress, preserving very strong bipartisan congressional support extended over multiple years. And the oasis, the bipartisan oasis that was created in Congress to preserve them, even in the midst of hyperpartisanship, required high-level investments. Many of these were stirred by the perception of a security threat, particularly around HIV in the 2001, 2002 period. One point that we'll hear discussed is that whenever you launch major initiatives, whether they're bilateral or multilateral, coming with presidential imprimatur attached to them requires a very high-level mobilization across multiple agencies over several years in order to get those institutions up and running. And when they falter, when they stumble, as in the case of the Global Fund in 2011, it requires high-level interventions. Both Bill Steiger and Eric Gooseby were involved in both sides of that fence in terms of the Global Fund. Another factor that we'll hear more about that drove this was, of course, the sequence, the rapid sequence of health security threats. The SARS, pandemic flu, Ebola, Zika. These were ferocious. They were rapid, in rapid sequence. They caused dislocations and chaos that required interventions coming from not just from our health, as we'll hear, not just from the health sector, but from many other sectors, and begged questions also that moved beyond that as to WHO reform, as to reform of the way we organize ourselves in our own government. The Blue Ribbon Commission on Biodefense is just one recent example in which leaders like former Majority Leader Tom Daschle, former Governor Ridge, former Senator Lieberman joined in an effort at looking how we organize and plan for the future. The Global Health Security Agenda itself, which was launched with a push by President Obama, was growing out of much of the same impetus. Many issues come out of this change. Where do you look outside of the health sector for capacities, for procedures, for lessons learned that are applicable? We'll hear about that. There's the outstanding question of whether these are temporary and transitory phenomena, or whether they in fact have graduated into a more permanent status. There's always a continued tension or neuralgia over having health and security blended in this way. And there's implications long-term as to what are the institutional capacities, the data deficits, the financing, and the levels of continuous high-level attention that are required. I've asked our speakers to come prepared talking about different dimensions, but to try and capture those in anecdotes around their career moments, those key pivotal moments that were dramatic, in which they were called upon to really think through and make tough decisions. Amy Pope is going to lead off with a discussion of the Obama White House experience in managing Ebola, and with that comes a discussion of the launch of the Global Health Security Agenda. Amy served in the White House, in the Obama White House, as Deputy Homeland Security Advisor and Deputy Assistant to the President at the National Security Council. She's currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Eric Gooseby will follow, and he'll be focusing on steering PEPFAR's engagement in key partner states, such as South Africa in the post-Mbeki period as Zuma came to power. He'll speak more broadly about the diplomatic requirements and the degree to which he is calling upon Secretary Clinton and others within the White House to advance this agenda. Eric served from 2009 to the spring of 2014 as the director of the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator. Today he is the UN Secretary General's envoy on tuberculosis and runs the Center for Global Health Implementation Sciences at UCSF, and is a terrific friend. He will be followed by Bob Kadlec, who will be speaking about biodefense in the post-9/11 period. Bob is a physician and a career officer in the Air Force, who's served in many positions across the White House, Senate, and DOD on biosecurity issues. In the period 2007 to 2009, was Senior Director on Biodefense in the Homeland Security. He's currently, if I get this correctly, Bob, Acting Director? Deputy Staff Director, Senate Intelligence Committee. So we'll turn to Bob for that. The fourth speaker we'll hear from is Bill Steiger. Bill is currently a senior advisor at the Western Hemisphere Bureau at the Department of State, and took that position on a few weeks ago. He was during the Bush administration for 8 years. He served in Health and Human Services, and he founded and he led the Office of Global Affairs, which has grown in that period to become terribly important. In that period, he served on the executive board of WHO, executive board of PAHO, and the board of the Global Fund. He's also been very active in recent years in restructuring and moving forward the Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon Initiative out of the George W. Bush Presidential Institute. He's a historian by training. I also want to add that one of the very important roles that he played after leaving the Bush administration was in 2011, when the Global Fund entered a crisis, a financial and managerial crisis. There were calls for an external independent review. The board of the Global Fund agreed to do that. Former Secretary Leavitt agreed to take that on with a few others, and Bill was tapped to, on a crash basis, do a sort of soup to nuts analysis of the Global Fund and come up with quite a number of granular recommendations on how to reconstitute the fund and get it back on its feet, which he did in record time. The board accepted and endorsed, as I recall, every recommendation contained in that, and within a year's time, the fund was back in action and getting a good bill of health. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to move rapidly to hear from you as well. So we're delighted that you've come, and we're delighted that these four leaders are with us here. So Amy, why don't you kick things off?
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Stephen, to you and to CSIS for all of your support of the work that we did within this administration and frankly, for quite some time to advance global health security. You've been a real friend and partner, and I've been very lucky to work with you. So just to give a little bit of context for those of you in the audience in terms of where I'm coming from, I actually am not a public health person. I'm a lawyer by background. I'm a prosecutor. I started my career at the Justice Department and focused quite a bit on transnational threats. And what that meant to me when I was at the Justice Department were things like cyber threats, drug cartels, other human trafficking organizations, other sort of criminal style threats to the United States and to our allies. And it wasn't until I was at the White House and the National Security Council staff that I really grew to appreciate why emerging infectious disease needs to be taken with the same level of seriousness and treated in often with the same tools as we consider these other kinds of threats. It was when I was leading the Transborder Security Directorate that we had Ebola. It was already emerging in West Africa. Frankly, when we were assessing Ebola at that point, we were pretty persuaded that we had the situation well in hand here in the United States, that there may be one or two cases of Ebola that came from West Africa to the U.S., but that our hospitals had it under control, and that the infection control procedures that we already had in place would serve us well, and everyone should be fine. You all know, if you turned on the television at all during that point in time, that we were not fine. It took one case, one Liberian national who came over to a hospital in Dallas, who was quite sick, who was misdiagnosed in the first instance. And then once he came back to the hospital, the infection control procedures were either not followed or were insufficient. And all of a sudden, we had not only a public health crisis on our hands, but we had a crisis of public confidence. And it was that experience that really brought home for me and brought home for many of my colleagues who worked together that we needed to really distill our focus and really rethink the procedures that we had in place within the United States to keep the U.S. safe from disease. Coincidentally, at that same time, we were launching the Global Health Security Agenda. It actually had launched just a few months before Ebola really broke out into the mainstream, but it was serendipitous because what the Global Health Security Agenda emphasized was this need to detect disease, prevent it, respond to it well before it ever came to the United States. And so if you needed an example to highlight why the Global Health Security Agenda was so important, Ebola was it. And if you think about it, as I do, if you think about transnational threats, it's consistent. What we were doing with Global Health Security Agenda is consistent with the way we think about other threats, whether it's counterterrorism, aviation, cyber, et cetera. Our goal here in the U.S. is to push our borders out, because there's so much more we can do to prevent a threat to the United States outside the United States than once the threat is actually at our borders or inside the United States. And so using some of that same theory, that sort of the concept of pushing our borders out, I think the global health security agenda helps to achieve that. It emphasizes the need of building the capacity in countries around the world, because those are the countries that are most likely to see the first instances of the disease that could become our problem in the US or other countries. And so the synergy between those concepts, I think, is really important. I think the important piece here, and what we can't lose sight of, though, is that we haven't to date provided the kind of resources that we would provide to those kinds of threats that we would otherwise take as seriously. So if you look at counterterrorism and you look at our counterterrorism budget, when you look at the ways that we have built a bureaucratic structure within the federal government to connect the dots and make sure that there is as good a layer of defense as possible to protect the United States from counterterrorism, we still have a long way to go when it comes to emerging infectious disease threats. So I think I don't want to spend too much time because we'll have a conversation about this later, but I think that's the way, the sort of rethinking emerging infectious disease, not as sort of an after effect, not in a reactive mode, but thinking about it in line with the other serious transnational threats to the United States, I think is a direction that we need to go as a country. We've started down that path, but I think it takes significantly more resources, significantly more attention, and sort of a bureaucratic architecture that still needs to be built up.
Thank you very much. Eric?
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to speak to this issue. I too want to thank Stephen for putting the panel together and for his general, the role he plays is really become truly catalytic for raising the questions of concern that need to be unpacked and understood so a rational response can be generated. So thank you and CSIS for that. I would say I was asked to talk to the relationship that the U.S. government has and continued to foster as the PEPFAR program had been started, had put the basic foundations of program in place in 15 to 18 countries in a significant way, and were about to benefit from those structures, those systems of care being robust enough to start to move patients through them at a more rapid pace. During the time that President Obama inherited PEPFAR from President Bush's efforts, the rev-up of patients went from about 2 million up to about 7-8 million in the time frame from 9 to about 14, and then continued to go up to the 11+ million after that. That rapid rise in people getting in front of delivery systems, being diagnosed and initiated on antiretroviral therapy, putting them in a dependent relationship with that system of care was a fragile, non-sustainable relationship. And the initial concerns in taking over the program were in understanding what were the elements that would pivot management, oversight, monitoring, and evaluation back into country-focused responsibilities, and what could we do to insist that governments begin to prioritize investing in health for their people. South Africa was about a quarter of the PEPFAR budget in terms of allocation. They also reflect that much of the epidemic, so it made sense to align that way. The infrastructure in South Africa is better, stronger, more rooted than in other countries, and they were able to move down the road faster and assume more economic responsibility for payment. So they, from the very beginning, were paying for antiretroviral therapy for the antiretroviral drugs. As we shifted from brand to generic, their ability to assume that cost was enhanced, and we took full advantage of that moment. We also, as PEPFAR, began kind of divided the pie up into kind of everything other than the cost of drugs was what we invested in, and the discussion I had with government, really at the level of the Minister of Health, the Minister of Finance mostly. The President was involved in it, but it was mostly Minister of Finance, Minister of Health, was really about specifically, explicitly, what would be the pivot in the costs for each of the different costing sites as we made an agreement that would, over a 3-year period, transition over half of the cost to South African government. The political pressure in the United States was real. PEPFAR was coming up for a reauthorization. The discussion within the appropriations committees was one of, have we created an entitlement? Having to take the argument and march it around the hill each time, not only for the annual budget, but also for the reauthorization. Those sensitivities and concerns were right in front of me in doing that, and much of my ability to move PEPFAR to an annual budget that was secure and also to the reauthorization was based on South Africa and their ability to demonstrate to appropriators that they were assuming this seriously and making that investment concretely. CODELs that were taken over were critical to solidify that in the minds of appropriators. I would say that Lindsey Graham took this on in a way that was startling, in that he got radicalized around the issue, understood the burden of disease and the role the United States played in framing and nurturing that response, and saw it as an investment in our country in a way that others didn't. And he was catalytic in bringing that clarity to the appropriations discussion. I just would say that it became individuals that we were able to identify to make them champions, and I would say that that's a good example of how that evolved. So that's good, Steve.
Thanks, Bob.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you to my panelists here. What a pleasure. I have a couple of PowerPoints. I don't know, can you pull those up real quick? We're going to play a little Jeopardy here to start off. Stephen asked me to look at the evolution of biodefense since 9/11, but I thought it may be useful to take a look at a couple things. Can you guys do it or not? Excellent. So the first question is, who's the first president to institute a biodefense policy? Any guesses? Can you advance it? George Washington. Hit the next, build it again. George Washington, when he was with the Continental Army, was confronted with a smallpox outbreak in New England that threatened his fighting force. And he had to do something even before the creation of Jenner's vaccine for smallpox, which was variolate his army against the disease. For those who are not familiar with that, you basically take the pustules from active cases, dry them up, and then the person actually inhales them like snuff. And for the 95% of the people who don't become ill with smallpox and die, or who survive, the other 5% get ill and may die, they're protected. So he's the first president. Next slide. Keep building. Sorry. So who wrote Presidential Executive Order 11490, which basically recognized that catastrophic events can happen that can threaten our national security, and one of the specific areas was under the health functions. And what may give this away is the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Any guesses? Hit build. Richard Nixon, October 1969. A month before he basically declared, if you will, the termination of our offensive BW program, they were already thinking about what biodefense would look like. For anybody who's interested in forensic bureaucracy, it is impossible to see what impact this executive order had subject to anything other than what was written here, anything to do with legislation or appropriations or anything else. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Oh, great. So, what president said terrorism is coming? And that the future will be terrorism with weapons of mass destruction? Any guesses? Saddam Hussein. His prophecy in 1993. Now, Bill Clinton was a very important player in this before 9/11, arguably because of a gentleman by the name of Joshua Lederberg, who wrote the equivalent of an Einstein letter to the president, outlining the risks of the coming advances in biotechnology and the opportunities that individuals could basically threaten societies with highly virulent organisms, as well as reading The Cobra Event by Robert Preston, was impressed with the idea that we needed to do something. And he turned to two people on Capitol Hill, Senator Frist and Senator Ted Kennedy, to basically do the initial bill that created a national pharmaceutical stockpile and also did things to improve biosurveillance. So, as we march forward, prior to 9/11, what president wrote this? Now, you may not be able to see it very well, but I'll read it to you. We need a stockpile of antibiotics. And I'll tell you the year was 2000. We need to have and develop sensors to detect in cities to detect the release of pathogenic organisms, and we need to prepare for the possibility to prevent panic and ensure that we don't get blackmailed. Any guesses? Donald Trump. Yes, published in 2000. So there are lots of surprises around biodefense policy that I think lead us to the point of what happened since 2000? Well, a lot. Obviously, the anthrax letter attacks were not a bioterrorist event, but a biocrime. And with that, though, there was appreciation that there was significant policy gaps. And at the White House at the time, when I was a director on the Homeland Security Council, the operative presidential directive HSPD 17 dealt with countering WMD, which had a piece of it dedicated to consequence management. But it was recognized by the seniors then, Ambassador Bob Joseph, who was the Senior Director for Counterproliferation Policy, and the President, and the Vice President, by the way, Dick Cheney, that that was insufficient. So, as the scribe of that document, I was asked to basically do a BioNet assessment to evaluate the sufficiency of what we did, and this was in April of 2004. What's significant about this was a couple years after the event, right? The anthrax letter events. But it was really the fact that in some ways, everybody started running to the races and running to do things and develop programs to deal with bioterrorism, pandemic influenza, without a strategic framework in place to do so. And that resulted in HSPD 10 or NSPD 33, one of the few joint Homeland and National Security presidential directives that were signed by the Bush administration. 4 pillars or 3 pillars identified there. And the one other that's not there is threat awareness, prevention, protection, surveillance and detection, response and recovery. And since then, there have been a number of further presidential policies that have been drafted both in the Bush administration and the Obama administration that basically build on that particular document. Now, one thing you don't see here, which is a significant gap, which is pandemic influenza. So if you recall, there was a national pandemic influenza strategy that was separately drafted and along with a plan that was representing, if you will, a hole in HSPD 10, which was an assumption that quite frankly proved to be false, which was pandemic influenza is a lesser included case to bioterrorism. That is incorrect. And so now, as we look forward, and in the National Defense Authorization Act of this year, there will be actually a mandated, congressionally mandated revision of the National Biodefense Strategy to hopefully reconcile that gap and also, if you will, assimilate all these other great documents into one document. Now, all this says one thing, and Amy made an excellent point. Policy, no matter how many reams of it, without resources is rhetoric. And that is the dilemma that in some ways we face today. So we spend annually approximately $10 billion on national missile defense. How many missiles have landed on us so far? But the answer is, how many times have we had an emerging disease of significance, whether it be Ebola, SARS, MERS, Zika, and we've been relatively less than prepared, I'm being polite here. And do we build half an aircraft carrier? Aircraft carriers cost about $17 billion a copy, and we spend about $7 billion on our national biodefense, which includes deliberate as well as natural as well as pandemic threats. So this is not an issue just that exists in the executive branch, but clearly in Congress. And so I'm going to leave you with this last anecdote, how it works. So back in 2006, when I was the staff director for the subcommittee of bioterrorism that was chaired by Richard Burr from North Carolina and Senator Ted Kennedy, there was a great concern about pandemic influenza, avian influenza. And in doing so, the president offered that we would need to spend $7 billion over 2 consecutive years to basically fund the necessary preparations for that event. A lot of it was around influenza vaccine. And so he sent a delegation which was led by Secretary of HHS Mike Leavitt, Tony Fauci, Julie Gerberding. I mean, this is rock star group here. They came in to give a top secret briefing to members of both the House and the Senate. They did it separately. And there were about 14 senators in the room that I was in. And because it was a top secret briefing, I was the only person on the staff that was allowed in there along with the senators. And quite honestly, there was nothing secret about it. What transpired was Tony Fauci talked about the technical issues, Julie Gerberding talked about some of the public health issues, and then Mike Leavitt pulled out John Barry's book, The Great Influenza of 1918, and read graphic passages that scared the bejesus out of the senators in the room. Who were the senators in the room? Besides Ted Kennedy, Tom Harkin, Senator Barack Obama was one of them, as well as Senator Hillary Clinton. It made a great impression on them all that in the next day, during the routine defense appropriations bill, a number of those senators ambushed Ted Stevens and appropriated not $3.5 billion that was requested by the government or by the executive branch, but $7 billion. And that was one way, if you will, graphic passages to people not familiar with the diseases and their processes, convinced them that this was something that they didn't want to happen on their watch. So Washington is a wonderful place. They're full of surprises and opportunities, and I thank you for this chance to share at least 1 or 2 anecdotes.
Thanks, Steve. So I think I'll try and wrap everything up quickly by talking about something that's an evolution of what everyone else has talked about, which is a movement from idea to directive to bureaucratic change. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story around bureaucratic change at the Department of Health and Human Services to institutionalize an international mission in a structural way inside the department that now, today, I think plays a much bigger role in international affairs than it ever had before in its history, certainly before 2001. So I give a lot of the credit to this to Secretary Thompson, who had a vision that Bob outlined about the need for health to be a central component of national security. Prior to 2001, Bob could correct me if I'm wrong, the Secretary of Health and Human Services was rarely seen at any meeting of the National Security Council, and staff from HHS rarely participated in deliberations in the White House around national security issues. In 2001, as soon as he came into office, Secretary Thompson resolved to change that. He had worked very hard on state-level biodefense and pandemic preparedness-related issues when he was governor of Wisconsin. He himself had been heavily influenced by John Barry's book and made all of us on his senior staff read that book in the first months of first months after coming to Washington. So he resolved to make 2 big changes in the way the department functioned. One was to create what is now the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Public Health and Emergency Preparedness, or ASPR. Because he believed that, and his lawyers, Stuart Simonson among them, whom you know well, had read the Nixon executive order, and he believed very strongly that there was a role to play, as I say, and that previous directives had never adequately been implemented. And he found in what the Clinton administration had done a good base, including the Strategic National Stockpile, but wanted to give that a home with a policy framework around it and a staff to not just talk about managing the deployment of countermeasures in an epidemic, but really all of the planning and strategy that needed to go ahead of that in preparation for both flu and potentially man-made events. And the second one was to create what's now the Office of Global Affairs, to, for the first time, institutionalize in the department a place for coordination of all international issues on a bilateral basis with the multilateral institutions that focus on health, and to be the node of interaction with the other interagency players on these issues at the NSC, with the State Department, with USAID, with the Department of Defense. There had not been a robust international office in HHS before that period of time. So he asked me to lead that up. And together, those two institutions since that time have allowed the department to play, I think, its now natural role of an implementer and a policy setter as part of a larger interagency conversation on global health security, something that the Obama administration has continued, and this administration, I think you will see continue further. I'll close by fast-forwarding to one other innovation that I credit to Secretary Leavitt, whom Bob Cadlick mentioned. So several years after this, and it's important to remember that the things I'm talking about with the changes that Secretary Thompson put in place predated 9/11. A lot of people make the assumption that 9/11 and the anthrax attacks were the catalytic events for the creation of these two parts of HHS. They were not. They were actually in the governor's secretary's vision well before that. And what happened in September, October, November 2001, I think proved their usefulness, and they went on to grow and become more robust with things like the appropriations that Bob described. But there was one component then missing when Secretary Leavitt took over in 2005 that he put in place with our help, and that was a robust international presence for the Food and Drug Administration. So if you look at the new HHS, 15 years later, the three big new pieces of the department are OGHA, or OGA now, ASPR, and a much more robust international presence for FDA. Why? Not simply because we want FDA to have offices around the world. It was for the specific purpose of being prepared by forward deploying our experts of FDA to be ready to take action immediately and to, indeed, if possible, prevent events that involve the adulteration of our food supply, our medicine supply, our diagnostics and medical devices that come in such large measure from overseas. And it was a crisis around product safety with adulterated substances and products coming from China in 2006 and 2007 that led an interagency group to, under the President's direction, make a series of recommendations about changing the way we deal with imported products. And one of the most important one of them was to internationalize, globalize the FDA. And part of that was to give the FDA more explicitly resources and authorities to handle a national security mission, not just a mission around its traditional regulation of the marketplace here in the United States, but a recognition that part of global health security has to do with the things that we consume, not just the pathogens and the potential bioterrorism agents that are out there.
Well, thank you. There's a couple of things that jump out from listening to the four of you speak. Three of you talking more about directly security-related issues, and Eric talking about dealing with the inheritance on the bilateral relationship and the magnitude of it with South Africa. One is that there's a certain serendipity that exists. In other words, there's the prior vision of where you want to go, and then a crisis appears unforeseen and creates a window and drives things forward, and that window opens up. And in the case of PEPFAR, it's really a kind of moment arrives where the political pressures have intensified to force this. It isn't the emergence of a pathogen, that sort of threat. It's a different thing. So you have this certain serendipity where the pressure accumulates. You don't really see it, and once it happens, the doors open. The second is that there's a prior vision that gives you a pathway, but the third piece is that each of you operated at a particular junction of different agencies where you were called upon to create something new, and you were charged with doing that. And you had to be rather entrepreneurial, and you had to be able to pull on higher-ups in order to make it happen, and you had to reach sideways in order to pull in other players with you. So I wanted to get to that question of your strategies. What you were all able to be successful at moving things forward and building new policies and institutions and changing the perceptions within the administration and outside the administration of what was possible. You also operated in an environment where bipartisanship was possible on the Hill. And you weren't fighting a highly politicized opposition, but you had enough running room in order to sort of make your case. So maybe each of you could say a few words about the political strategy that you pursued in this period, because I do think that your own entrepreneurialism, your calling upon higher-ups, your ability to pull sideways and deal with the Hill, all of those things, and communicating to a public were terribly important.
So I would note that there's a common thread that you hear from everyone's anecdotes, which is that in addition to being the work that was happening on the ground and sort of the nuts and bolts, there was some high-level political vision and political will that allowed us to drive something forward. I know from where I sat, unless President Obama and our National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, had a commitment and a vision of what could happen in West Africa if Ebola spun out of control, we would not have had the political capital and the political will to use that as a way to not only get pretty serious funding for our global health security agenda, but also just engage as we did around the world and in West Africa. And you hear the same, I think the same story emerging from all of us. You have to have somebody at the top who really will give you the room to run. So I think that's a big part of it. What I also find really heartening is that traditionally this has been a bipartisan issue, and I believe it has to be. I think the wonderful thing for me working in the security community is that it tends to be nonpartisan. We're all sort of looking at how do we best protect the United States from a variety of threats. And so I think what is most unfortunate is when it turns into a Republican Democratic fight over resources or presence abroad, et cetera. And so I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to make sure that it remains bipartisan and to build the relationships across the aisle. I know that there are champions all across the political spectrum, and that we lose once it starts to become politicized. So I think that's the other thing, is to be deliberately seeking out the allies from this entire spectrum of advocates.
Well, I'll just distill it into 5 very simple parts here. I think Amy pointed out the role of the president. In my experience, also the vice president is extraordinarily beneficial, at least during my tenure with Vice President Cheney. Clearly, department heads, and I think Bill highlighted Secretary Thompson, Secretary Leavitt, enlightened leadership makes a big difference. Congress is an interesting group of 535 people who think they're president. And you really don't need them all to move a mountain or make things happen, but it is that bipartisan nature, and to witness it myself with Senator Kennedy, with Senator Burr, and with others. And there are people like that today, Sheldon Whitehouse, Lamar Alexander, and others who are committed to this, Senator Murray, who are committed to these issues. So it's not a hard sell, and you don't have to get everybody, but key people. The media and outside groups are very important, and then the American public play a role in this. And I think if you can harness all that in a way that can be clearly articulated and affordable, I think you can go a long way to achieve what you're trying to achieve.
I would just add to those 5 points, just underline the importance of a bipartisan approach is, I think, critical for these types of programs that really are non-starters without top-down political support. If presidents, department heads don't have this as a priority, you're going to have a very difficult time moving any resources, let alone expand them. And I think that the approach to bring in the concern of not on my watch that you pointed out really resonated with me. For our colleagues on the Hill and in the White House, it's rarely talked about that directly, but it is the underlying kind of elephant in the room. And it is easy to relate on a human level to those types of concerns. So I often found my role was to translate the science so they understood it on a personal level, and if possible, get them experiences with the specifics of that. So all of those unwritten, the things that you would have to write a volume of words about get translated instantaneously. The Codells are really critical for that purpose, to understand the depth and breadth of the PEPFAR contribution to a population is very hard to articulate, but easy to walk through programs and see individuals benefiting from them. I would say that the final group is the community. The balance to the dialogue you create within the government, both in all its facets, Hill as well as the White House and the departments, is often amplified, carried more specifically, more consistently, and made a domestic constituency issue when you are able to rally individuals in the community to be that informed, educated voice that educates the principals in the allocation decision process. I would also say that for each of the partner countries in which we work. One of the our ability to enhance the likelihood of an investment coming from partner countries in the health of their people was in using our role as the United States coming in and setting up critical life-sustaining or life-saving programs for hundreds of thousands or millions of people in their country. We were in a especially strong position to push the envelope, to help organize the constituency and country to reflect back the need to persist and continue to fund those programs. And I think that was another aspect of it.
Yeah, quickly, a couple things to add on that last point that Ambassador Gooseby raises. In the original discussions around PEPFAR, one of those community sectors that was so important to the bipartisan embrace of the president's vision was the faith-based community. And that it was local churches around the country who put positive pressure on their members of Congress to do something about global HIV as a moral imperative. That removed many obstacles that there might have otherwise been in the approval of that vision and in the appropriation of the dollars that went with it. And the faith community has been a stalwart supporter of that effort at PEPFAR through 2 administrations, was crucial to the creation of the President's Malaria Initiative afterwards, and has been also a big supporter of American engagement and leadership on global health, period. So that was an explicit part of the political strategy around PEPFAR and its subsequent reauthorizations. For global health security, a couple of things. One political dynamic that both Secretary Leavitt and Secretary Thompson took advantage of in the discussions around biodefense or national security and health was the existence of a group of either former governors in the Senate or people who wanted to be governor in the Senate and subsequently have become governors, or people, and in the House mostly, people who were former state representatives and senators who had dealt with many of these issues at the state level. And it's, those of us who live in this bubble don't always realize that the conversation out there in the rest of America is often more advanced on some of these subjects than it is here. And governors were farther ahead than the federal government in thinking about preparedness because they saw the nightmare scenario that came true in the hospital in Dallas. They were closer to the effects of being unprepared than we were here in Washington. And the last thing I'll say is that you cannot underestimate the impact of the anthrax attacks on Capitol Hill. Remember that those were letters sent to congressional offices, and senators, congressmen, and their staffs felt personally vulnerable to both man-made and natural pathogens in a way that they had never been before. That brought at a very, very close emotional level the issues around being better prepared to them more than anything else.
Let me ask a question more on a more negative side, which is, as you look back in your tenures in the different roles that you've played, what were the most memorable moments where you were stopped from doing what you thought was essential to do, and why?
I can't say that I was that I have an example of being stopped, but I do think because I work across a range of different threats, including in counterterrorism, aviation threats, other sort of threats brought by people, that the resource question is a real one, and there's just no alignment of threat to impact on populations. And I think that is, there's fault within the executive branch, there's fault within the Congress, there's sort of fault to go around. But I just don't think that we have done the kind of analysis and then funded proportionately what we need to do to really keep the United States safe from the next pathogen. And I think just about the fight that happened around Zika, learning from what happened with Ebola, on Zika, we started paying attention very, very early to it. In January, the president was convening his security and health folks. In February, we went forward with a supplemental request to Congress. And our thinking there was, we were behind the ball on Ebola. Let's get ahead of this. We know this is coming. We know we're not prepared for it. How do we get to where we need to be? And that turned into a fight over resources in Congress that I don't think we fully appreciated going into it. And what we saw was some members of Congress asking us to give back or to use the money that we were using to fight Ebola. And for people who are looking at this threat comprehensively, you understand intuitively why taking money away from one public health threat and applying it to another public health threat doesn't make us safer as a whole. So I'd say it's almost sort of the short-sightedness that characterizes Washington politics was really the challenge at all levels. And I think that sort of the negative here is that we need to figure out a way to get beyond just reacting and providing resources in the reactive crisis moment and figuring out kind of a better long-term strategy here.
Not that it's a defeat, but it certainly was a setback, was at the end of the Bush administration, approximately $1 billion budget amendment was approved by the president, sent up to the Hill. It was actually entertained by the majority, which was the Democrats in the House of Representatives. And again, there was not a lot of love lost between the House Democrats and the president at that time. But still, the basis of the budget amendment was we need to be better prepared for pandemics and bioterrorism. And that got approved, and then went to the Senate. And it came at a very auspicious time, which was the terrible near depression event that happened in our economy. But I think, based on the idea that we were very concerned about a pandemic, there were some members who still just didn't quite think that advanced spending on these kinds of issues was appropriate, and some, one in particular, basically made an impassioned floor speech suggesting that this was not the appropriate time to fund preparedness for pandemics. Now, regretfully, that was captured on tape, but more significantly, about 30 days later, the H1N1 pandemic happened, and that tape was played over and over again. So it was the idea, though, and I think the moral of that story is that no one had reached out to that person to kind of convey the necessity of preparedness for these kinds of things. For pandemics or bioterrorism, there is no just-in-time preparedness. And the idea that you have to kind of pay it forward is challenging for our form of government, which we have annual appropriation processes that quite frankly turn out to be continuing resolutions more than not. But it's this idea that we have to find more creative ways to fund these kinds of programs. And that's something that quite frankly has yet to be done, though I'm encouraged by the fact that it's been announced that at least the intention of the current Secretary Price, that they're looking to establish an emergency response fund for medical events. And so arguably that could be the equivalent to the disaster relief fund that DHS has that funds FEMA. Details to be revealed, but I think that's an encouraging sign.
You know, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were looking for, but the one failure that really stands out in my government career goes back to the about 97 in the Clinton administration. I was the director of the National AIDS Policy Office and had just finished setting up the Ryan White Care Act, which was the kind of PEPFAR for the domestic AIDS outbreak in the United States. 52 epicenter cities, 50 states, services that really moved and kept HIV as an outpatient response. At any rate, during that, we became acutely aware of the unique challenge that injection drug users face in trying to contain HIV, and that the systems that we'd set up for the rest of the HIV at-risk community were not reaching the injection drug user. We spent a couple of years amassing the data, actually doing research that validated some of the unanswered questions. It was an all HHS effort. NIH, CDC, HRSA, the FDA, SAMHSA, all were actively engaged in trying to understand this better and make the argument for why, from a public health perspective, that intervention became critical. It went all the way through approval in HHS and went through approval in the White House, but the idea of federal dollars funding needle exchange programs, even when we could quantitate the impact it would have on incidence, was not enough to quell the political fear that appropriators carried in trying to explain it to their constituencies. And right up to the last moment that it was going to be approved, it was still in play, and I'll remember that period as an extraordinary disappointment for both the individuals that would have benefited, but also for the United States to not be able to kind of step into the leadership role for what is and has continued to be a very controversial issue. So
mine is a little less important than that, probably, but it has to do with legislation, which is, as we know up here, often fundamental to the success of these visions. Whether these visions can be successfully carried out depends on, in many ways, how Congress decides to take that vision and write it into a bill. And one of the few regrets I have about my time at HHS is that I was never able to push hard enough to get the Public Health Service Act amended. That's the law that undergirds almost everything that HHS does. And with certain exceptions, it really is inadequate for the international mission that the department has. And so this engenders a theological discussion every time these issues come up, including some of these issues we're talking about here, and the department's involvement in PEPFAR, where the lawyers get together and question whether the department has the authority to do these things. So clarity in the Public Health Service Act is really necessary in the longer term to strengthen the department's role in everything that we've talked about, including in interagency cooperation on HIV, on malaria, and on national security-related biodefense and pandemic preparedness.
I'm going to invite everyone who cares to pose a question to come forward. There are microphones in each of the aisles, and in posing your question, please identify yourself and give us a quick, very succinct, single comment and question, and we'll bundle up a few of those. Ultimately, here I do want to bring the conversation back before we close to the question of the future and what advice, just to plant the idea here that if we can close with a view on looking ahead and what your advice would be to this administration and Congress in that regard. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Excellent panel. Carlos Santos Burgoa, Professor of Global Health Policy at the George Washington University School of Public Health. I had the chance to manage the non-medical interventions during the H1N1 epidemic in Mexico, and we were able to work shoulder to shoulder with the United States, Canada, and GORAN on the health security issues related to that. Why we did that? I think because we had the public health institutional capacities. So my question to the panel is, why not to focus more the strategy on building the institutional capacities of the countries to really address these international security issues, and rather than just in specific programs?
Thank you. Any other questions at this point? Okay, why don't we come back to who would like to pick up on that question?
Yeah, I think that's right. It is the global health security agenda that ultimately I would say where I sat within the administration, that's exactly what we think needs to happen. You need to build the institutional capacity. You can't do that without resources, and that means multi-year budgets and multi-year commitments. We need to have partners within our Congress who are committed to doing that, and we can't have sort of every outbreak require sort of a new fight about resources, right? So that's the vision that we have, and I think it's a question of making sure that we have champions within Congress who make sure that vision is funded.
Anyone else care to come in?
Just 30 seconds on that. You're right, and Amy's right. It should be about institutional capacity building. It's something that we tried to do in the Bush administration in some small ways that were important, like building pandemic vaccine manufacturing capacity overseas so that the world is not reliant on our manufacturing plants here in the United States, on getting the international health regulations amended so that they now really fully cover these kinds of events and circumstances. And the third phase is now what is happening under the global health security agenda to get individual member states to comply and to have the institutional capacity to comply with those regulations. So that's exactly the right path, and I hope we are able to continue that work going forward.
Yes, please.
Hi, Mary Pittman from the Public Health Institute. A number of you have alluded to the role that not only government but also the private sector can play. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we might be able to build a different set of relationships that would be a little less volatile if we could get public-private engagement around these global security issues.
Thank you. Let's take the other question, please.
Hi, thanks to the panel. My name is Katie Millar, and I am a global maternal newborn health researcher. Thank you. It was great to hear more from the domestic government side of things and approach to global security and global health. My question is, from your perspective, what are ways that we can build stronger bridges between academia and international NGOs, and what can we provide to you and the government in order to strengthen policy that will support our efforts?
Thank you. Why don't we start with Bob? There should be a mic right there.
Oh, here it is. So I think the first one, which is about how do you build better private-public relationships or establish both, and I think that's been a challenge for a long time. I think emerging from a lot of these scenarios And I think it's a matter within the big pharma companies. I'm going to use pharma as an example, but I think there are other great examples in terms of where companies are engaging at a local level, domestically and internationally, on these issues. But I think the thing is that there seems to be a greater sense of what you call it social responsibility to assist. And so some of this is pricing of vaccines so that its differentials could be more affordable in lower income nations and the like. But I think part of this is also recognizing, and I think it was Pepsi-Cola, and I hope it was Pepsi-Cola, that recognized the value of its distribution routes, particularly in Africa, as it related to cold chains. So that actually could move product, which could be vaccines or other temperature-sensitive materials, across. So I think some of this is identifying these, what I'd say, more socially conscious companies, which seem to be many and more as we go forward, but also identify those things, if you will, which do have true dual use and benefit. The last thing I'd say is that sometimes it's also helpful when you have incentives. And so if there are tax incentives or other incentives that become created for these kinds of things to motivate folks, I think there's a variety of tools that can be utilized that have not been optimized for this set of issues, both domestically or internationally.
Thanks. And in terms of the public-private partnership, PEPFAR did almost 260 public-private partnerships in the 4.5 years I was in it, which is an extraordinary number. One of the lessons learned with that was that the ones that lasted and did not just take the form of writing a check were those that took the time to understand what was the corporate's real interest in engaging. And the closer we could get it to aligning with a profit motive, their profit motor, and motive in why they get up and do it every day, like I think it was Coca-Cola. That's okay. Like Coca-Cola did with the cold chain, was putting it central to giving them license to go ahead and factor in a profit agenda in this work. And when we put that on the table, the programs got stronger, bigger, the resource funding for it became evident, but most importantly, it lasted. And they continued to do it because they had a self-interest in it. So I'll just leave it at that.
You do academia too?
I would say, to me, academia, the Academic Medical Center has not found its role in global health yet. The Academic Medical Center does wonderful research and does training and does the convening and kind of projection of where a field should go over time. But the funding for an academic medical center does not really create the freedom to do what is needed or to align with the partner countries' agenda and needs in the urgent, emergent way that the global health dilemma in terms of the diseases would warrant. Countries that we work in, we are often not aligning that research effort with the global burden of disease and the response to it. We are sometimes not finding the sweet spot where the intellectual advance of the inquiry, the understanding of natural history or pathophysiology or therapeutic interventions also align with where that Ministry of Health's burden is in identifying, entering, and retaining people in care, for example. And so often you can look at research projects where just a little tweaking of a research project would align with that common, what I perceive as a common need. That need to be opportunistic and find a funding line is overwhelming universities now in a way that that had they if there was an independent funding line that came to them without having to scramble so much, and when it's threatened, everything turns to trying to preserve it. It would allow the higher thinking, if I could say that, and I'm in the middle of this too, so don't misunderstand me. But where that higher thinking can be part of what you think about, because the brain trust in academic medical centers is extraordinary, and it is not focused and sustained on the problems of our time in the way they could be. And I think we have to look in ourselves and ask, are we doing everything we can do in the way we could do it to benefit the most?
I'll just say two things. Absolutely. Having come out of a PEPFAR-funded, or at least supported public-private partnership with academic medical center partners, we have run into all of those things that you said. That's absolutely the case. The model of the structure and the financing of those wonderful institutions just doesn't line up with what ministries want, which is now not an assistance relationship. They want a peer-to-peer relationship with American experts. That's also true for government, by the way. Increasingly, no matter where a country is on the income scale, it doesn't really want a consultant funded by USAID, as competent as those people are, to come out and tell them what to do. No, they want someone at HHS or at an academic medical center who is a world-class expert in whatever that subject is, and it could be everything from infectious disease to healthcare financing, to food and drug regulation, to the structure of our programs against drug abuse, opioid abuse. There are lots of these subjects where ministries come to the United States all the time, and they want an interaction of peers, and we, collectively, both on the academic side and the government side, are not structured or funded to respond to that demand.
Roger? And then we'll
that was a very interesting session. And I'm always thinking about the expression that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. When these outbreaks have occurred, and I think of the outbreak of Ebola recently, the U.S. is incredibly generous in going out and providing a rapid response. And we do a great job on that. What we haven't done as well on is following up to prevent the next outbreak. And I wondered if in the allocations and the allotments, we spent $1.5 billion or so on the Ebola outbreak. We haven't spent much in preventing the next outbreak as we might to avoid those expenses of the past. Are there any insights you can give to think beyond the first year or the first 6 months in some of the responses that we engender?
Thank you. We have two others. Let's take those and then we'll close. Yes.
John O'Quick with MSH and No More Epidemics. Eric talked about the importance of community and getting the resources and support. And Bob Cadlick talked about, yes, having the champions in Congress, but also the media and the public. And you made the point that policy without resources is rhetoric. But right now, the budget proposals are cutting some of the most important elements of our public health defense system. And the question is, what is the community for public health preparedness, locally and globally, just back to Roger Glass's point about prevention, and what are the most compelling arguments that would carry the budget that it's going to take to do that? Because we still are not very close even to a pandemic, a universal flu for pandemics.
Thank you. One last question? Or two we have.
Yes, Oliver Fine from Weill Cornell in Manhattan. Thinking in terms of where the resources might be within the federal government to support these kinds of efforts, certainly the military is one of those. And I was curious what the barriers are to extracting funds from that source to do this kind of prevention and security.
Thank you. One final question?
Mike Engelgau, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Great discussion. My question has to do with sustainability, and I think Eric Goolsbee touched on most directly with his comment on the South Africa example, where they actually could pick up what was being given by the program, and that was a big success. And I could see that. I'm thinking about for the more acute threats that come and then they go, yet we have to keep some infrastructure and efforts going even when times are quiet in anticipation. And I'd just be interested in how you think about that in those quiet times between the crazy times to keep the interest of funding and leadership.
Thank you. Should we start with Amy?
So there are a couple of you who sort of touched on a similar theme, which I think is how do we maintain the commitment even after the initial crisis is over. That is built into the global health security agenda. It assumes that countries participating will undergo independent analysis evaluation to assess where they stand against particular metrics, and that the both internal to those countries and external in terms of funding to those countries, the funding will be and efforts will be targeted toward meeting or mitigating the gaps that have emerged. And so that's something that a whole range of countries have agreed to, both in terms of undergoing the analysis themselves, but also contributing to mitigating the gaps more broadly. But I think that goes to the, not to harp on this over and over again, but I really think it's critical. In Ebola, we got funding that envisioned a multi-year commitment to the global health security agenda. That's not something that we should trade off on in the future. We should trade off against the next emerging infectious disease. We need to be able to do both at the same time, build this long-term sustainable architecture around the world, as well as respond to the next emerging infectious disease. And on that line, I want to pick up on something that also got named in this conversation, which is the need for a contingency fund. This is something Tom Frieden has talked about quite a bit. It's something that I personally believe in. That's something in the president's budget, which I was very heartened to see. Let's take it out of the politics. Let's have an emergency fund that is meant for emergency response to the latest disease, so that we can keep both tracks going in parallel, both the long-term response as well as responding quickly and outside of the political sphere to the most critical issues.
I just want to talk about one thing about sustainability, and this is just an observation from my time on the Hill, as well as kind of dealing and thinking about these issues, and that is we almost have a schizophrenic approach to this, in the sense that somehow we think that we have on one hand a healthcare system that does things day to day, that provides babies vaccines and takes care of mothers and take care of diabetics and do all these other things. And then on some extraordinary circumstance, we have another healthcare system that gets invoked to respond to an emergency. And it seems, and again, the artifact that I saw was when the Pandemic All Hazard Preparedness Act was passed in late 2007, again, 2006, excuse me, was on the verge of the fact that, the Senate had flipped and that there was a new president coming to town, and that there would be a healthcare bill that would basically revamp healthcare for America. And what was not considered there, and it was a deliberate decision, was, well, how does that contingency care system get factored into the daily care of everybody? And so that's one of the challenges that has not quite been annealed, I'd call it. And that is understanding that the same public health people that are day-to-day taking care of the elderly and the socioeconomic disadvantage are the same people who are going to have to provide the pandemic flu vaccine in an all-out crisis or smallpox vaccination program. Same thing with the hospital systems are going to have to manage this. And so there has to be kind of a way to, as I call it, put the thread of preparedness in daily health care. And some of this is, how we man it, how do we incentivize it, to your point. The profit motive, the CMS reimbursement motive, reimbursement motives that are out there that could be used, and other things. And Tom Harkin had a great vision, I thought, that I think many in the Senate embraced, was really around, if you look at the federal highway system and realize that this is a system that created by the Eisenhower administration, goes coast to coast, and it was to enable commerce, interstate commerce, and amongst other things, but also national defense, was the idea that somehow that's the kind of healthcare system we'd like to have in this, and a contingency care system that no matter if you get pandemic influenza in New York or Texas, or Ebola exposed in Texas or in New York, that somehow you're confident that the care that you're going to receive and the capabilities that you're going to receive are the same. And so that's just something to think about. It doesn't get to maybe some of the particulars about DoD, which is a different kettle of fish. But I think it's the point, though, that we haven't factored this in to our routine healthcare delivery systems.
I guess I would just add it's tragic that we can rally support for an Ebola outbreak, bring millions and millions of dollars to bear with the acute threat. People can understand that. The fact that it isn't something that will have to be sustained may even facilitate the willingness to engage. But I think it is a vulnerability that we could close that we have not closed. And I don't, the whole outbreak of the Ebola, the IHR 2005, the health regulatory framework, beautifully describes a surveillance system that is present in every country, that is kind of the first responder and identifies the threat. And then kind of multilateral organizations, WHO, et cetera, are then mobilized. What we had was a multinational NGO with relatively a small number of sites identify the outbreak. And it speaks to, and all three of the countries involved in the early outbreak have no infrastructure that touches, that would see those individuals as they presented themselves to the medical delivery system. It's not rocket science. We know how to set that up. The fact that we don't set it up, I think, is something that we need to take ownership of and correct. The thinking is there. People have thought through the whole thing, but we still, at that first link in the response, remain as vulnerable as if there is nothing behind it. So I think it takes a political will. It takes leadership. A country like the United States can play that role, often does play it, but needs to sustain it through the aftermath of the outbreak to put the system in place that will be able to anticipate and alert the system at an earlier point. And we support those, expand the capacity of those countries who are going to be in front of the actual outbreak to have the response, the surveillance system in place to alert us. Those types of simple fixes, we need to go through the system and make sure our ability to see and respond are in place. And I think we're just about to kind of tip into that level of specificity, I hope. So.
And one of the opportunities that's coming up immediately to start that conversation is the future of polio. And the polio eradication network and all of the surveillance system, the laboratories, the field workers that have been set up to get the job done on polio. They can be repurposed. They should be repurposed. That strategic conversation is just beginning to happen, but there is no consensus on exactly what to do. But it will be a tragedy if we let this infrastructure lapse, as happened after smallpox, without making sure that those people and those institutions can be put to bear to help find the next potential pandemic and to provide that kind of tripwire surveillance system that's needed out there. One other comment on preparation. I wish, in terms of research and preparation, there's a great role for our research institutions to play in the preparedness agenda. And one thing I think is not yet completely coherent is the connection between the world of zoology and veterinary medicine and human medicine. And if I could wave a magic wand and have us spend a little bit more money on one particular thing on this agenda, it would be bats. We do not know enough about bats as a reservoir for many of these potential pandemic diseases we're talking about, and the research into them is often siloed between various parts of the veterinary world and the medical world.
Well, we've gotten to the end here, and I promised the organizers that we wouldn't run over time. And so I want to, first of all, thank you all for coming and participating with us today. And most importantly, I would like to thank our 4 speakers who've come and spent the afternoon, a good chunk of the afternoon here with us. So please join me in thanking them. Thank you. People were, people were.